America Foundation is co-sponsoring today's program with the Center on Law and Security at New York University. This is a 4-year update of a very important forum we did 4 years ago called al-Qaeda 2.0. If I can have everyone's attention, please. Thank you. And if we can close the doors, Sam. I want to thank Karen Greenberg and Peter Bergen, who are my partners in helping to produce today's forum. I want to say a special hello to those viewers all over the country and world who are watching on C-SPAN live all day. And that's one of the reasons why we're not taking breaks, is because there are a lot of other people who are glued to their seats as well, and we want to thank them. I also want to thank those people watching on various blogs around the country, including my own, The Washington Note. 4 years ago, we tried very, very hard to gather together some of the world's leading chroniclers of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Zawahiri, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and among the raft of people who joined us at that time were Yusri Fuda of Al Jazeera, Hamid Mir, who is one of the people who had written a lot about bin Laden, including many Western journalists, of course, led by Peter Bergen and others. One of the people we tried very, very hard to get in this country, and we could not, was my friend here, Abdel Bari Atwan. Abdel Bari Atwan happens to have the distinct pleasure of being on the FBI watch list, and it's tough to get him in the country. And I don't know why he's there, other than he is one of the first to spend a couple of relaxing days with Osama bin Laden in 1996. He hasn't done so since, and we have an outstanding panel nonetheless. But I want to say, I want to thank the State Department formally, and the White House and the FBI and others for letting Barry in the country this time, because I think he'll be an outstanding contributor to this panel. He's an important writer and chronicler. Abdel Bari Atwan is editor-in-chief of Al-Quds Al-Arabi, one of the world's leading daily Arabic newspapers since its founding. He's based in London. He's the author of a very important book, which I recommend folks who are into this subject read, The Secret History of al-Qaeda. He is really one of the, when you talk about diversity of views, which I think we've achieved in terms of today's panel on the American side, there are authentic voices on other sides of this that are important to hear too, and so it's a real honor to have Abdel Bari Atwan with us. Brian Fishman is just to Barry's left, is Director of Research at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. He's published on al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda in Iraq, in fact one of the leading experts in the United States on al-Qaeda in Iraq. And he has co-authored Al-Qaeda's Foreign Fighters in Iraq, a first look at the Sinjar records and bombers, bankouts, and bleed out, Al-Qaeda's road in and out of Iraq. We look forward to hearing his views. To my far right, we have Tom Hegghammer, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment in Oslo. He is currently a visiting fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School, and he is author of 2 forthcoming monographs, very interesting: Jihad in Arabia, The Paradox of Saudi Islamism, and another monograph, Godfather of Jihad, Abdallah Azzam and the Birth of the Arab Afghans. We look forward to hearing Tom's viewpoints. I was introduced to Tom for the first time last night by Peter Bergen, who said he's one of the world's leading experts on Saudi Arabia, which, coming from Peter Bergen, is quite an endorsement. And finally, we have Mohammed Hafez. Good to see you again, Mohammed. Associate Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. He is author of Suicide Bombers in Iraq, The Strategy and Ideology of Martyrdom, and author of Manufacturing Human Bombs, The Making of Palestinian Suicide Bombers. We have an outstanding panel here. We're going to go where hope that your saturation point is about halfway full, because we've got an outstanding group of people here, and I'm going to ask my friend Abdel Bari Atwan to help set the stage for us. Barry.
Thank you very much. I would like to extend my thanks to Stephen and to Peter, because they gave me this opportunity actually to come here and to talk to you. And also, I would like to thank FBI, because actually they deprived me of the previous opportunity, which actually gave me more time to concentrate on writing my book about Al-Qaeda, which I accomplished, and it was published in this country, which was great. Anyway, maybe actually there is only one explanation that this country is not attacked by Al-Qaeda, simply because they prevented me from coming in. So I hope the situation wouldn't be changed after my arrival here. Anyway, where shall I start? Okay, now to go to the business. I would like to first to start with Al-Qaeda in North Africa or the Islamic Maghreb, because in order to understand what will be the situation or how the situation will be in Europe, we have to concentrate on Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb. It is extremely important because there was a shift between Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb. I remember the first liaison between the two sides. It was in the early 90s when Osama bin Laden was based in Khartoum in Sudan. He sent an envoy to North Africa, to Algeria in particular, and that envoy was Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, who is a very important figure of Al-Qaeda. He went to Algeria. The GIA in that time was in its peak. The Salvation Front also was fighting the government because it was deprived of winning the election, parliamentary election. Abu Mus'ab al-Suri went there with an offer to Algeria or Algerian Islamic groups that Osama bin Laden is willing to finance the jihad in Algeria against the infidel regime there. Abu Mus'ab al-Suri came back to Khartoum with a very depressing message. He said to Osama bin Laden, as he wrote an official letter or an official report to his boss, that they are very radical, there are a lot of infightings among them, they are very moody, and there are a lot of groups and a lot of splits among these groups, so it is better to leave them alone. That was the recommendation of Abu Mus'ab al-Suri to Osama bin Laden in that time, in 1994. But Abu Mus'ab al-Suri actually continued his contact with Al-Qaeda, with the Islamic groups in Algeria. He moved to London. He has a Spanish passport and a Spanish wife, so it was easy for him to move freely in Europe. And he came to London and set up a research center and start issuing a newsletter on behalf of these Islamic groups in Algeria. And he was coordinating with with another very dangerous man, Abu Qatada, or Abu Omar, as they call it, the Bin Laden ambassador in Europe. Again, the experience wasn't rosy at all. A lot of split, a lot of infighting among them. So Abu Mus'ab al-Suri gave up completely, and he went and joined Osama bin Laden and later Taliban, and he became some sort of a media advisor to Mullah Omar of Afghanistan. Algeria or Al-Qaeda in Algeria actually wasn't the choice of Osama bin Laden. He was in the run. He wasn't actually in contact with these groups, but Abu Mus'ab Abdul Wadud, he decided, the leader of the new Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, he decided actually to give bay'ah to Osama bin Laden and to be member or part of Al-Qaeda in that part of the world. So bin Laden has no other choice but to accept him. It doesn't mean he didn't like it. The same thing actually happened with Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, another Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, when he imposed himself on Osama bin Laden and gave actually the bay'ah at later stages. Why Al-Qaeda in Algeria is extremely important? Simply because it was reflecting the transformation of Al-Qaeda from a pyramid-built organization to a flat, loose organization with franchises all over the world if they can. So it was actually a clear-cut indication that Al-Qaeda is transformed, Al-Qaeda is changed, Al-Qaeda decided to decentralize and gave the regional Al-Qaeda branches more authority and more actually say. It is important for many reasons, Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb. First, it is a unifying factor. It does unify the Berbers and Arabs. We know in North Africa there is Berber and Arabs, so this is the only actually body which can unify the Islamists from the Arabic side and the Islamists from the Berber side. So it is very important because it unified the two races together, which there is a lot of fractions among them recently. This is one thing. Second thing, it is an important, and that's why they call it Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb. They didn't say in the Arabic Maghreb, they didn't say in North Africa, they said in Islamic Maghreb, so it is Islamic umbrella. No here division or actually differentiation between Arab and Berbers. The second important thing, Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, Islamic Maghreb, can be a safe haven for the Islamic groups in the whole of North Africa, like the fighting groups of Libya, like the also radical organization in Maghreb and also in Algeria itself. So it could be a safe haven to give, actually, to attract, like a magnet, other Islamists who couldn't find a place after al-Qaeda actually was destroyed, or al-Qaeda base or homeland was destroyed in Tora Bora and Kandahar. The third important element is al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb is important because it can be a springboard to send groups to Europe. It is very close. The fourth important thing is we know there are a huge reserves of oil and gas in Algeria. And we know that the West and Europe in particular trying to use Algeria as a substitute, as alternative for the Russian gas. We know Europe is 30% dependent on Russian gas. So Algeria, there is a pipeline to Europe, and this could be alternative. And the fourth important thing, as I said, Algeria is very close, and there are at least 7 to 8 million of European nationals who descend from North Africa. So you have at least about 5 million in France, and about 1 million in Germany, and also several hundreds in Holland and Belgium. So it is very important. First, it can export cells, sleeping cells to Europe. Second, it is very important they can have influence inside the Arab community or Muslim community in Europe, France in particular. And we noticed that attacks actually which took place on Madrid on 11th of March in 2004, most of those people involved in these attacks were from North Africa. It is very significant. About 5 or 6 attacks took place in Paris, were actually the descent of North Africa. The assassination attempt, which targeted the ex-king of Afghanistan in Rome, they were from South Africa, from North Africa. Also, it was very important that a group who assassinated Ahmad Shah Massoud were actually from North Africa. So it is very important from this point of view. So another point which I would like to refer to, in Algeria, you don't need, or North Africa actually, Algeria in particular, you don't need to import arms. You don't need to train those people. They are already armed, and they are already trained, and already also mobilized and radicalized. They were fighting for the last 10 years or so against the Algerian government. So they are well trained. Also, North Africa and North African people, Algerian in particular, are very fierce fighter and very radical and very moody, and they were like a breeding ground for al-Qaeda when al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan. Even when al-Qaeda moved to Iraq, many people from Algeria, from Morocco, from Libya joined al-Qaeda there in Iraq. And we have to remember that the second ranking of al-Qaeda, the second layer of leadership of al-Qaeda, mainly from North Africa. You see Abu al-Faraj al-Libi, you see Abu Hafs al-Mauritani. Most of them actually were very, very fierce fighter and very good leader. So also that's why this area in particular is very important for al-Qaeda. So now, since al-Qaeda moved to Afghanistan, the birthplace, it does need North Africa, it does need the Islamic Maghreb for future operation. We have to remember why al-Qaeda now, when it's moved back to its birthplace on Afghanistan, it is more dangerous for Europe and more dangerous for America itself. You know, I was listening to people, my friend Peter Bergen, saying that, you know, it could be no threat to United States now. I believe because Al-Qaeda went back to its birthplace, I think now the danger can start it. If you look at the previous attacks of Al-Qaeda, most of them were planned in Afghanistan, not actually in other places. In Iraq, it was very difficult for al-Qaeda to move. It is actually locked country. It is surrounded by hostile governments like Saudi Arabia, like Syria, like Jordan. Even when the Syria gave some access for al-Qaeda people to join the Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi in Iraq, the American exerted a lot of pressure and managed to seal the border completely. In Afghanistan, the situation is completely different. Why it is different? Afghanistan is a landlocked landlocked country. It is like the belly button of Asia. It is surrounded by 7 friendly countries, and also Pakistan, which is a falling state, as my colleagues briefly said. So it is very easy for al-Qaeda now to plan attacks on Europe or on the United States if they can, because they enjoy the safe haven again of Waziristan. They used to enjoy the safe haven of Tora Bora, now they enjoy the safe haven of Waziristan. How it is also dangerous for Europe, because we have, as I said, for example, about 1.5 million in England in particular, in Britain, who are Pakistani nationals or Indian nationals, actually originally from India and Pakistan, and they are naturalized British, and they can go easily to Afghanistan, and they can go easily to Pakistan, and they can make contacts from Al-Qaeda, with Al-Qaeda leadership. Especially we know now it's Bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abu al-Yazid al-Masri. They move freely in that part of the world. So for the first time, Al-Qaeda now, they can make direct contacts. Previously in Iraq, it was impossible for them. They were not in full control of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, and also they were in the run trying to survive as long as they can. So that's why Al-Qaeda is dangerous vis-a-vis Pakistan and Afghanistan. If we come to Europe, Europe is again, there are 32 million Muslims in Europe. 32 million Muslims, this is including Albania, but most of the rest here are from either from North African origin. For example, there is 9% of French population is Muslim. There are 6 million Muslims in France. And then if we go to Netherlands, for example, Muslims represent 5.8% of the population. Britain, 1.6 million in UK are Muslims, 2.8%. Denmark, for example, 5%, 270,000. Spain, 1 million Muslims, representing 2.3%. Germany, 3 million again, represent 3.6% of the population. And Germany maybe is different a bit, because most of those Muslims are from Turkish origin. And if we notice recently, when Al-Qaeda start to feel more confident in Afghanistan, many new recruits start to join. And it was actually noticeable that there is a great deal of them from Turkey. So Turkish people who are supposed to be, part of NATO, now some of them start to go and join Al-Qaeda. And also we noticed that a lot of, or hundreds, if not thousands, of people from Yemen, from North Africa, are joining the ranks of Al-Qaeda again in Afghanistan. So when you have about 32 million in Europe, and when you have these boats, actually immigrants boats are pouring toward the shore of Europe, you have to feel you are really in danger, facing a future danger. And also, again, Europe can be a springboard for attacks on the United States itself. Many people say, okay, yes, we managed to prevent Al-Qaeda from attacking this country. It's true. Al-Qaeda was not prevented. Al-Qaeda is very busy fighting American on Afghanistan and Iraq. They don't need to come here. Now, before, yes, because the Americans were far away, about 10,000 kilometers away. So they exported people to blow up the World Trade Center. But nowadays, they are very busy because they have actually troops there, about 160,000 troops in Iraq, maybe about 23,000 in Afghanistan. So they don't need actually to go and fight. Already they are busy. But these sleeping cells, or these cells in Europe, actually, in the future, if it is going to be reactivated again, when Al-Qaeda becomes more confident, maybe there will be a possible danger. This is one thing. How the Muslim people in Europe actually feeling now toward Al-Qaeda, I believe if you look at 7th of July attack 2005, you notice that at least 2 of them, Tanweer and Muhammad Sadiq Khan, they were in contact with Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So they were subject to training sessions. Also, they were ideologized, ideology lessons from Al-Qaeda leaders. So they were behind. Ayman al-Zawahiri appeared with them in a videotape in that time. So they have well connection with Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the situation in Europe, again, is encouraging, in a way or another, Al-Qaeda to set up bases or to recruit cells in Europe. Why they are doing so? Because here in the United States, you can assimilate it easily in the society. After 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you feel American. You become American citizen. You become, like anybody else. But in Europe, for example, it is completely the opposite. For my son, who got blue eyes and fair hair, and born in London, and he speaks native English, educated in England, until now, he is 23 years of age. Where do you come from? From Britain. No. Originally, where do you come from? Your parents. I said, I born in London. I said, no, your parents. Oh, my parents are Palestinian. Yes. So you are not Britain. You are not British. Yeah, you are not English. You can't. You're still foreigners. This kind of difficulties in assimilating the Muslim migrants in Europe actually created a good opportunity for al-Qaeda to manipulate the frustration of the European community, of Muslim community in Europe. This is one thing. Second thing, after 11th of September, the Muslim community in Europe were actually under, I don't want to say they were terrorized, but at least they were suspected as a potential terrorist, especially by the tabloid media. There were a lot of media targeting Muslims in particular and spreading a state of Islamophobia in that part of the world. So that's why many people actually were frustrated, and I wasn't surprised when about maybe 50% of them actually were no, a couple of minutes? I'm talking about two subjects. Al-Qaeda in Europe and North Africa. I should have 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Anyway, so nowadays what will happen? I think now we are facing a very, very difficult times. Islamophobia is spreading, the saga of cartoons, offensive cartoons, and a lot of articles and programs on the media, European media, targeting Muslim as a potential terrorist, as I said. And if this economic climate is going to spread, we have been told that the recession will continue maybe for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, God knows. And we know that Muslims in Europe are discriminated at when it comes to jobs. For example, the Muslim is likely to stop and search 17 times more than non-Muslim in Britain. So it shows you how those people actually are pushed toward al-Qaeda. Again, I would like to say al-Qaeda is not a mass organization. It's not actually like Muslim brotherhoods. What you need actually, you need just few people, carry out certain attacks and make a huge fuss, make a huge publicity. Al-Qaeda in North Africa, they join Al-Qaeda proper simply because they need the experience of Al-Qaeda, they need the credibility, they need the name because it is a brand, they need the experience of Al-Qaeda in publicity. So publicity is the oxygen of Al-Qaeda. So that's why if there is going to be any attacks or something like that, in order just to say, here we are still alive, and we can hurt you, we can reach you, and dominate the main headlines and the news bulletin and television all over the world. That's how Al-Qaeda is functioning. I would like to conclude by saying, unfortunately, we are not heading toward a very rosy period. I think it could be extremely difficult, as I said. Al-Qaeda is actually, after 7 years, nowadays we are the 7th year, well, maybe celebrating or commemorating the start of the bombardment of Afghanistan, Tora Bora, and Kandahar. So after 7 years, Al-Qaeda is still there. Is it matter if we capture or kill Osama bin Laden? Yes, it is extremely important. We know in the Middle East, it is one-man show. Everything is one-man show. It is Mubarak is there for 30 years. It is Hafez al-Assad, he was there until he died. Algerian president who actually, he is going to amend the constitution in order to extend his presidency for the 3rd term. So Al-Qaeda is the same. Al-Qaeda is bin Laden. He is actually a cult figure among among his followers. I once made a grave mistake in my life. I was invited to Kuala Lumpur in Sri Lanka to talk to Commonwealth writers, and somebody asked me, how do you describe Osama bin Laden? I said, he could be, like Buddha, but a violent Buddha, a terrorist Buddha, because he gave up everything. And he distributed his land to the peasants, and and fought or start to fight for his own organization. He could be a Gandhi, but a violent, a terrorist Gandhi, because again he actually gave up everything and he started to fight for his own cause. And then I left immediately, and at Heathrow Airport, I was received by about 30. Indian and Pakistani journalists waiting for me there, said, how dare you actually characterize or compare Osama bin Laden with Buddha and with Gandhi? I said, I didn't. I said, a violent, a terrorist Gandhi, a terrorist Buddha. And until now, they didn't forgive me. Thank you very much.
It's good to be here from West Point. In the afternoon classes at West Point, oftentimes you get cadets that start to fall asleep, and what they do is they stand up against the wall in the back. So if anybody starts to get sleepy during this, feel free, I'm used to it. A couple of notes before I start. I do teach at West Point. I am a Department of the Army employee, but I speak only for myself. I have academic freedom. I don't speak for the Army, DOD, the U.S. government, and I should make that clear up front. Let's see if the other thing about working for the Army, though, is that they require you to use PowerPoint whenever you speak, or they dock your pay. So here we go. The first thing to know, I think, about when we think about al-Qaeda's experience in Iraq, I go back to a book that was written in 2003 by a guy named Abu Bakr Naji called The Management of Savagery. And he said two things. He said there are two things that are going to be most important in this present period. One, 9/11. Two, the war in Iraq, and the most important things that those would achieve is that they would destroy what he called the deceptive media halo that is around the United States. And what he meant by that was that he assumed that there was this media halo that compelled people to think that the United States was untouchable, that it was not even worth challenging it. And that primarily is what we've lost in Iraq. And that is what al-Qaeda has gained. At the end of the day, if nothing else, they've gained that. And I think we should start with that in mind. So what I'm going to do today is really, I'm not going to give you my own ideas because I don't understand this nearly as well as many people. One of the people that I don't understand this nearly as well as is an actual Islamic State of Iraq commander in Western Iraq who has written an after-action review of al-Qaeda in Iraq's experience there and what went wrong. And so rather than tell you what I think went wrong, most of what I'm going to do here is tell you what he thinks went wrong. And I think that will be more illustrative. A couple of points. Al-Qaeda in Iraq really is this sort of joint hybrid organization. It's got Iraqis in it, and it's got foreign fighters from all over the place in it. And these two groups oftentimes do not get along. They're often motivated for different reasons. They often cannot communicate with each other very well because of language and cultural differences. Some of them, especially the outsiders, are often deemed to be very imperious. The Iraqis tend to be motivated oftentimes by smuggling, criminality, just finding a couple of bucks. And we need to understand that this organization is not monolithic. With all of these organizations we've talked about today, that's clearly a theme, and that's definitely true with al-Qaeda in Iraq. AQI's strategy from the very beginning, before it was al-Qaeda in Iraq, when it was Tawhid wal Jihad, Monotheism and Struggle, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's original group, the strategy was this, and Bruce Hoffman mentioned it earlier, and he got it exactly right. The strategy is to attack the Shia in order to incite a response, and then in the theory that al-Qaeda could step in and protect Sunnis, and in doing so, would actually win their support. Right? That's the strategy. That's the fundamental strategy. And to a large extent that worked, right? I mean, they were able to incite the response. Where they failed was that they were not able to provide the protection they thought they would be able to. And that was disastrous for the organization, and we'll walk through that a little bit. So, what is an organization? And I don't know if you can see this or not. I'll read it if you can't. An organization like AQI, and I stole it and adapted this framework from my boss, which I hate to admit, but it's true. The four pieces, right? Strategic flexibility, and what I mean there is the ability to adapt, right? So we might think of this really as operational flexibility within a coherent strategic framework. Second, you need sanctuaries. Third, you need organizational coherence. You need the different aspects of your organization to be actually working towards a common goal, right? And you need somebody out there defining what that common goal is and providing a framework for the various things that are, the various operations that are going on. Fourth, you need to be able to regenerate. You need to be able to infuse new blood. And so what we see is a couple of things. Well, strategic flexibility is inherently limited in al-Qaeda in Iraq, number one, because of the ideology, right? And this is a problem for al-Qaeda writ large, is that they have very sort of clear and rigid notions of what is right and what is wrong, and that minimizes their ability to, or at least decreases and constrains their ability to make strategic and operational linkages. And the big one, and I think many of us have overlooked this, but I really think this is truly critically important. In October of 2006, just after, a month after, the first awakening councils were announced, al-Qaeda in Iraq declared something called the Islamic State of Iraq. And this constrained their strategic flexibility tremendously, because what this did is this was al-Qaeda. We all say that al-Qaeda doesn't have a vision for the future. Well, that's not true. They do have a vision for the future. This was it, and nobody liked it, right? So they do have a vision. They wrote it down. They wrote a book called Informing the People About the Islamic State of Iraq that was it was their Federalist Papers, right? It laid it all out. This is why this should exist. This is what our political structure is going to look like. This is what we're going to give the people that live under us, and nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted it. Now, why that's important, though, is that when they plugged into this already built normative schema of what an Islamic State ought to be, it further limited their ability to be flexible. Because people outside of Iraq were looking at this structure and they're saying, we know what an Islamic State should be. We need them to live up to that standard. And that means controlling territory. That means other groups subordinate to them. That means that they are the ones driving the political process. And they couldn't live up to any of those things. But because they couldn't, they sort of built in conflict with some of these other groups, the groups that became the Awakening Councils, the groups that became the Sons of Iraq, the groups that are still full-fledged insurgents but also don't like al-Qaeda, and they limited their ability to back away and recreate some alliances with those groups by declaring this political entity, or this would-be political entity. Sanctuaries. They need sanctuaries. Well, we all know what this is the one that we talk about a lot in the media here. What got rid of the sanctuaries? The Awakening, number one. The Awakening, number one, even more than the Surge, right? The local population can take away those sanctuaries far better than a couple of extra brigades, period. Special operations, that's a big part of it. And then the third part is a key piece of the Surge strategy, which was to push forward operation bases out into local communities, leave people there. So it's those three things that are doing this. Organizational coherence. Couple of problems here. One, poor strategic guidance. And that was a real problem. We tend to criticize Zarqawi for his bad strategy and for killing the Shia and angering a lot of people. But the one thing that he did well is he had a very clear strategic plan. Everybody knew what it was. Everybody in his organization knew what was going on. He announced it to the world over and over and over again so that there was a context for what was happening, for the operations they were committing. When he was killed, al-Qaeda in Iraq failed to do that nearly as well. Their message got far more muddied. Abu Hamza al-Muhajir simply didn't do the same job of describing what was going on, even if it was bad. So they lose some of their organizational and strategic coherence, I think. Weak command and control. This is a clear problem, buttressed by the Awakening, buttressed by a lot of these other things. Communication really broke down. We see in numerous cases in Iraq where the leadership of al-Qaeda in Iraq and this Islamic State of Iraq trying to make up for the operational decisions of their commanders on the ground, where the commanders on the ground literally are saying, hey, we know what to do, we know how to interpret our commander's strategic guidance, we're going to act, and that means we're going to go attack the Islamic Army of Iraq or one of these other insurgent groups, and then afterwards you see the leadership trying to roll it back, right? Because they didn't have clear command and control and they couldn't provide clear strategic guidance. Decreased mobility is a big one, and that's a big part of this. One of the things we see with the foreign fighters is that they had a real disconnect between their human resources on the one hand and their material resources on the other. Right? So even where they did have a sanctuary, they had one resource, but it was no good unless they could match it up with another, and they couldn't get the two to meet. Right? They couldn't get the two to meet, and without that, it was operationally useless. Regeneration. This was a real big problem, and I'm going to focus on this one a little bit, is unskilled foreign fighters coming in. Most of these guys coming in, with a few exceptions, didn't know what they were doing. Right? They really just didn't know what they were doing. They came in, and the infrastructure in place came to the conclusion that the only thing these people are good for is suicide bombings, right? This isn't about everybody that shows up at Iraq wants to be a suicide bomber. Some did, but in many cases you've got the local command on the ground saying the only thing you're good for is to be a suicide bomber, right? That's all you're good for. And there are a couple of exceptions, and the big exception I would say is Algeria. The Algerians that were coming in because they knew what they were doing, as we just heard. They've had training. Logistical failure we talked about, and then this cultural disconnect between foreign fighters and Iraqis, where language becomes a real problem. That one of the reasons why you can't move the foreign fighters to where they need to be is that it requires a major operation. You've got to keep them hidden because they can't run around through a tribal area of Iraqis that are going to pick them out very easily because of language problems. Okay. Again, the words get even smaller on the PowerPoint. But these are taken directly from this AAR. He identifies, our commander, who's unnamed, identifies 4 kind of problems here inside of Iraq. Number 1, through the last 4 years, crusaders learned from their mistakes. He says that's number 1. So we should all feel pretty good about that. That we actually did change some of the things that we were doing and able to motivate. Oh my gosh, 2 minutes left. All right. Through the last 4 years, so we did learn, and that helped, and he's identifying it here. 2, reliance on creating ordeals within the Mujahideen by tempting some factions to fight against the Islamic State with the direction of the Shiites, right? This is the issue of pressuring other insurgent groups, other Sunnis, to accede to your control. We've heard about this one a lot. It's al-Qaeda saying, you can't fight on your own, you have to do it under our command. 3, pressure that was placed on ordinary Sunnis as a result of their cooperation or their sympathy with the Mujahideen. What he's getting at here is the issue that Bruce identified earlier, which was al-Qaeda's inability to defend Sunnis when the Shia came in looking for retribution. 4, the absence of the full empowerment of the state, the declaration of an Islamic State before it was ready to actually assert any control, and that decision was made October 06, during a time period when we were actually collapsing troops into Baghdad, and I think what they were trying to do was pull the trigger and build something up outside of Baghdad so they'd be ready. Ayman al-Zawahiri, for years, from that original famous letter to Zarqawi in 2005, what he was warning about in that letter when he said, stop killing the Shia, the reason he did that is because he wanted them, Zarqawi, to build a political structure that would be in place when the United States left. That's the lesson that Zawahiri learned from experiences like Vietnam, from Somalia, is that the US can crumble quickly and leave. And what he wanted to make sure was that al-Qaeda was ready with a political infrastructure so that they wouldn't lose out to other Sunni groups, to the Shia government, if that were to happen. That he wanted to put that structure in place before we left. Ultimately, it backfired. So the problems from outside Iraq, and this is where we get to, is logistical problems I discussed. Foreign fighters come in, they expect the kind of propaganda, the kinds of attack they see in jihadi propaganda, big huge explosions, lots of dead Americans. What they get is small, low-level attacks against Iraqi manned checkpoints. They get frustrated. The Iraqis themselves are angry that these self-righteous foreigners are coming in telling them what to do, when really what they want to do is make a few bucks and smuggle across the border. And what we get here is ultimately this. The Islamic State of Iraq is faced with an extraordinary crisis, our commander writes, especially in Al-Anbar, and this difficult stage forced the leadership to reduce the entry of Muhajirun immigrants for many reasons, most notably the withdrawal of tribal support and the difficulty Muhajirun faced in moving about due to their inability to communicate in the Iraqi dialect. Right? The issue here, the takeaway is, they made the strategic decision to shut off the flow of fighters in. And where do those fighters go? As Nir Rosen said, they're going to the Levant, they're going to Afghanistan, Pakistan, some of them are going back to North Africa, and that's what's going on. But this was a strategic decision. This isn't people out in the provinces, out in the various places saying, I don't want to go so much anymore. This is al-Qaeda trying to turn off that spigot and trying to redirect it. And I'll just throw this up really quick. This is why you worry about Algeria, right? 85% of Libyans that show up in Iraq want to be suicide bombers. Only 13% of Algerians do. That should tell us something about where we may see problems in the future. Thank you.
Brian, thank you. Brian, thank you. These issues on adaptation are really important. We look forward to coming back in the Q&A section. I should also say for those people watching online or watching on C-SPAN that we will make available on the New America Foundation website, the Center on Law and Security at NYU, and the Washington Note website these PowerPoints because they are excellent, and for all of the presentations that use PowerPoints, we'll put those up. So let me now invite Mohammed Hafez. Oops. I try not to kill you.
Fortunately, I won't be using it. Well, let me first begin by thanking the New America Foundation and Peter Bergen in particular, and NYU Center on Law and Security for their kind invitation. It is an honor to be among a distinguished audience such as this. Last month, al-Qaeda's leaders issued a video montage that was referred to earlier called 7 Years of Harvest. Now, this video was about 1 hour and 30 minutes, and only 7 minutes of that montage dealt with Iraq. In those 7 minutes, the frustration of al-Qaeda's leaders was betrayed. It showed to what extent they were frustrated with what they called the traitors of Iraq. And here they weren't just talking about the Shiites or the Iranians, they were also talking about the Sunnis, or perhaps most importantly talking about the Sunnis. And all they could do in that video, in that 7 minutes that they dedicated to Iraq, is muster some calls for patience and perseverance. Now, this video drove home a point to me that I want to make that as my first point today, one of 3 points that I'm going to make about al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that point is this, that al-Qaeda in Iraq has suffered a strategic defeat. Now, what does that mean? I'm not talking about al-Qaeda no longer being able to carry out attacks or even spectacular attacks that could kill a lot of people. Obviously, they could still do that. We've just seen some attacks recently. This year, my count is up to at least 50 suicide attacks, which are usually attributed to al-Qaeda in Iraq. They are able to deploy female suicide bombers at an unprecedented level, and that is an achievement from their perspective. And so usually in insurgencies, a group that could inflict such harm is not likely to go away soon. But the ability of al-Qaeda in Iraq to achieve its strategic objectives and its long-term goals the strategic objectives have dwindled, and the window of opportunity to achieve its long-term goals is closing. So what are these strategic objectives? Brian has touched on them. I'll expand a little bit. There are 4 here that I want to focus on. The first strategic objective is to deepen sectarian polarization in Iraq so that Sunnis and Shiites are fighting each other, there's a civil war, and in that context, Sunnis, according to al-Qaeda's thinking, would see AQI as its partner and indeed as its savior. Today, this is not the case. Obviously, with the awakening councils and Sunni tribes and insurgents have largely shunned al-Qaeda. And secondly, Shiite communities are increasingly absorbing attacks by al-Qaeda without retaliating in the way that we've seen retaliations in 2006 following the Samarra bombing. So sectarian war, while in 2006, and I wrote this in my book, talking about there is a civil war in Iraq, that is no longer the case today. The second strategic goal is to rally other insurgent groups around AQI and indeed to make AQI the leader of the insurgency. The key thing that insurgent groups in the past have suffered is that they fight, here I'm talking about the Islamists within the insurgencies. They fight to achieve certain things in the military field, but then someone else comes and steals the political victory or the spoils. So the October 2006 declaration of an Islamic State in Iraq was a power move by al-Qaeda in Iraq, one that annoyed the insurgents to no end. In 2006, when Zarqawi was killed, I kept track of who are the organizations that sent in their eulogies. All but one, the 1920 Revolution Brigades, sent in their eulogies. Today, no one would eulogize Abu Omar al-Baghdadi or Abu Hamza al-Muhajir. So this is a second strategic defeat. The third goal that they wanted to achieve is to bring about the collapse of the Iraqi state, essentially turn Iraq into a failed state. And they did this by attacking the key elements of any modern state: economic and critical infrastructure, military and security forces, and the political elite and the political order. Today, Iraq is turning a corner, moving away from being a failed state to becoming indeed a rentier state, one that could draw on oil revenues to build its own fulfill its own services, build up its own military capabilities, although obviously now they're relying on the U.S., and ultimately to be able to use that rentier money, the money from oil rents, to be able to buy off social forces or groups that may oppose the elite. So to bring about a collapse of an Iraqi state, I think, is no longer possible. Finally, and the fourth goal is they wanted to turn Iraq into a safe haven for global jihadists who are interested in learning the ways and means of irregular warfare. Today, that is no longer possible because of the awakening councils and the fact that the Iraqi army now has at least 500,000, not just army, but the whole entire military and security establishment. So whereas in 2006, I would argue that all these strategic objectives were in play, and at times they appear to be achieving them, today I think that is no longer possible. And that is my first point. Now the second point is, that I want to make is that there are scenarios in which al-Qaeda in Iraq could resurrect itself like a phoenix from the ashes, if you will. One of these has to do with the Sons of Iraq. Now, if the Iraqi government, and by extension our own government, whether this administration or the next one, mishandles the handover of the Sons of Iraq to the Iraqi government, this could be a game changer, and one in favor of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Here we are talking about approximately 100,000 individuals who have agreed to fight alongside the U.S. against al-Qaeda in Iraq, and also to secure roads and neighborhoods and areas from insurgents and militias. These individuals, as you may have already heard and read, they are distrustful of the government. They see it as a sectarian Safawi government who's in the pockets of Iran on the one hand. But on the other hand, they are also they trust the U.S., that the U.S. actually pays them their salaries, and they're not sure that the Iraqi government is going to do that. Now, the Iraqi government has legitimate concerns. Some of these guys are not fit to be in the military, and if you've seen some of the Sons of Iraq, I mean, some of them are quite old and some are quite young. Some already have jobs, but they have signed up to be part of the Sons of Iraq to supplement their salaries. Others have blood on their hand, and others will not pass a vetting process due to a criminal past. And here I think we encounter a paradox. Those individuals who are most in need of reintegration and incorporation into the Iraqi security forces and government, because they are dangerous insurgents, are the ones that the Iraqi government is likely to say no to. So this is very tricky. How do we go around it? I don't know. But the point is, this is something that this administration and the next administration has to deal with. Because if these Sons of Iraq feel that they are betrayed by the U.S., then that will be a game changer, and that would confirm al-Qaeda's message to them. And not just al-Qaeda, by the way, groups like the 1920 Brigades, the Muslim Association of Ulama in Iraq, is saying this, that the Americans are going to betray the awakening councils and the Sons of Iraq. So it is important that we don't fit into that narrative. The second scenario here, and I think you all know that the situation in Iraq is obviously fragile and political reconciliation has some ways to go. And there are insurgent groups out there who are biding their time, thinking that the situation is going to turn, that the Americans indeed are going to abandon the Sons of Iraq, and the U.S. And the Iraqi government is not going to give to the demands of Sunnis. So therefore, it's absolutely necessary that we, in the U.S., both this administration and the next, that we keep pressure on the Iraqi government and its elite to continue the reconciliation process. The third and final point that I want to make today is that the only long-term strategic threat al-Qaeda in Iraq can still pose is if they decide to leave Iraq. This goes back to this notion that Peter Bergen spoke of earlier, and I think Brian may have hinted at, is this idea of the Arab Afghans. Now, those Arab Afghans that went to fight or support the Mujahideen struggle in Afghanistan, they were a handful. They were, a few hundred. Even of those, hardly any of them fought. Yet, despite their small size and limited participation in the Afghan struggle, you're able to get al-Qaeda, you're able to get groups who are eventually go to places like Bosnia, Algeria, Tajikistan, Egypt, Chechnya. Some have developed what's called the ABC service, the Afghanistan, Bosnia, Chechnya resume, or ABC resume, I should say. Now, that was then. Today, al-Qaeda in Iraq is one of the major insurgent groups. It has tremendous skills. It has an ability to, in terms of recruitment, getting individuals from all over the world to come to Iraq, to incorporate them in the insurgency. However badly they do it, that is still quite a feat. The ability to counter intelligence, to hide, the ability to create explosives, suicide bombings, mass casualty, experimenting with chemical attacks. That is a skill that if they export out of Iraq would be something that we will have to deal with for the next, and I'm afraid we may have to have another AQ 4.0 and 5.0 and things of that sort. So to me, the only strategic threat that is left out of AQI, interestingly, is not in Iraq, but if they leave Iraq, to go to places like Lebanon, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Algeria. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. You know, when I was in London recently, I spent some time with the defense attaché of Saudi Arabia, and I asked him there, what was your biggest worry? And he said that all of these problems around our region would end, and a lot of folks would return home, building on Mohammed. But to talk a little bit further about Saudi Arabia, you have Thomas Heghammer of Harvard University and the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, who's now going to focus on the Saudi side of this.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about Saudi Arabia, which is, after all, the original cause of bin Laden's jihad against America. It is true, as people have pointed out earlier, that al-Qaeda was founded 20 years ago, but bin Laden's jihad against America didn't start until the mid-1990s, and it started officially over the issue of US military presence in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia featured as a key theme in all of bin Laden's statements in the 1990s. You will remember in 1996 he officially declared war against America, or jihad against America, or against the American presence in Saudi Arabia. In 1998 he expanded his notion of jihad to include all American targets worldwide, but still the number one issue was the US military presence in Saudi Arabia, followed by Palestine and Iraq. So, but the strong presence of the Saudi issue in bin Laden's statements in the 1990s is in stark contrast with today's situation. If you look at al-Qaeda Central's discourse, Saudi Arabia is virtually absent. So the question is, what has happened in this period? Has al-Qaeda changed its objectives, and if so, why? And some of these questions I'm going to try and address, and I'm going to do this on the basis of 4 or 5 years of research into the history of jihadism in Saudi Arabia, extensive fieldwork in the country, as well as work on al-Qaeda's internal documents, etc. And I'm going to make 4 key points. The first point is that Saudi Arabia has more or less disappeared from al-Qaeda's discourse because al-Qaeda has failed in Saudi Arabia. The history of al-Qaeda's operations in the kingdom is a history of failure. We can divide the history of al-Qaeda's presence in the kingdom into 4 main phases. In the first 2 or 3 years after bin Laden declared jihad, that is from 96 till about 1998, bin Laden tried very, very hard to establish an operational infrastructure in the kingdom. He started off in 1996 with very, very few Saudis in his entourage and a very limited infrastructure on the ground in Saudi Arabia. People who visited him in Jalalabad in January of 1997 have talked about how there were virtually no Saudis around him, and how bin Laden himself was very frustrated about this. So in these 2 years, he tried systematically to build an infrastructure in the kingdom by sending recruiters, etc. He also tried to instigate attacks. He notably tried to organize a major attack in early 1998. This attack, however, was averted when the missiles that were supposed to be used in this attack were intercepted on the Yemeni-Saudi border. This missile plot, along with a number of other foiled al-Qaeda plots in the kingdom in the mid-1990s, taught bin Laden a lesson. It basically taught him that to carry out operations too early would be counterproductive in the long term. But basically what happened after these foiled attempts was that the Saudi police would crack down on the entire jihadist community and thus reduce bin Laden's potential recruitment base. So in 1998, at some point in 1998, bin Laden decided to suspend operations in the kingdom. There are many, many indications that bin Laden imposed a moratorium on operations in the kingdom in 1998. The idea was that that al-Qaeda would rather be used as a recruitment ground and a fundraising ground until there was a sufficient infrastructure in the kingdom to launch a jihad. So in this period from 1998 till about 2002, there were no al-Qaeda operations in the kingdom because al-Qaeda didn't try to carry them out. So this explains the curious absence of al-Qaeda attacks in the kingdom in the late 1990s. In the beginning, they didn't have that capability, and then in the second half of this period, they didn't have the intention. Now, this changed after 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan. In early 2002, the Central Al-Qaeda leadership decided to reopen the front in Saudi Arabia for a number of reasons. Basically, the strategic environment had changed, and the strategic value of keeping Saudi Arabia as a recruitment ground had decreased, while Saudi Arabia's relative value as a theater of operations had increased. So bin Laden gave the order to reopen the jihad in Saudi Arabia. So the year of 2002 was spent building an organization in the kingdom, mainly with recent returnees from the al-Qaeda's training camps in Afghanistan. And then the campaign was launched in 2003. And between 2003 and 2005, you had this famous campaign waged by al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, or QAP. Now, this campaign seemed to destabilize the country at first. It seemed very serious, and many Western commentators were very worried about the situation in the kingdom. But it eventually turned out that the QAP had been very efficient in creating the impression of being a very strong and powerful organization. In reality, it was a small alien element on the Saudi Islamist scene, and that the organization was relatively weak from the start. And by 2005-2006, the organization had been effectively crushed. And this is where, so we're now in the fourth sort of phase of al-Qaeda presence in the kingdom, and we're back to a situation that you had in 1998 and 2001. There is very little. There's no strong, organized Saudi presence, al-Qaeda presence in Saudi Arabia, and for all intents and purposes, there's no prospect of a revival of a local al-Qaeda organization in the kingdom. Now, why did this happen? Why has al-Qaeda never succeeded in establishing a strong infrastructure in the kingdom? And this is my second point. The second point is that there's never really been popular support in Saudi Arabia for al-Qaeda's agenda. Not even in the Islamist community. There is a perception in the West of Saudi Arabia as al-Qaeda country. And this stems, of course, from the 9/11 attacks, where 15 out of 19 hijackers were Saudis. But this is a truth with significant modifications. Saudi Islamist community has two characteristics which sets it apart from Islamist communities in other countries. First is that that pan-Islamism is very strong in the kingdom. So this is why you have more Saudis than fighters from other countries going to pan-Islamist battlefronts around the world, in Bosnia, Afghanistan, Chechnya, and elsewhere. And this form of activism, this sort of involvement in other Muslims' struggles of national liberation, is what I call classical jihadism. It differs, however, from what bin Laden was proposing, namely global jihadism. And in Saudi Arabia, classical jihadism has always been much, much stronger than global jihadism. And the proof of this is that if you look at the life stories of Al-Qaeda recruits in the late 1990s, they all show that people went to Al-Qaeda's camps in Afghanistan not because they wanted to carry out international terrorist operations against the US, but mostly because they wanted ultimately to fight in the classical jihadist front, be it in Chechnya or elsewhere. And Al-Qaeda used deception to get people to the camps. They told recruits that the camps in Afghanistan was only a station on the way to a classical jihad front. So Al-Qaeda had to use deception to get people on board to the camps where they could indoctrinate them into the full global jihadist doctrine. And a second feature of Saudi Islamist community is that it is very averse to anything that resembles revolutionary activism, and anything that resembles attempts to destroy the regime. And the proof of this is that the QAP, in its discourse, it consistently stressed the fact that it was fighting the foreigners and not the Saudi regime. It said it would kill security forces if they had to, but the main enemy was the outsiders. The reason why I think bin Laden had sort of misread the situation so much from the mid-90s until today is that the whole project of a jihad in Saudi Arabia was based on wishful thinking from the start. The idea had been articulated in the early 90s by people in exile at the height of the so-called Sahwist opposition to the regime, when there was optimism in the Islamist movement. So what about today? Is Saudi Arabia still a priority for Al-Qaeda? And this is my third point, which is I think that Al-Qaeda has been, although Saudi Arabia has been relegated on Al-Qaeda's list of strategic operational priorities. For two reasons. First of all, because Al-Qaeda was very, very badly burnt in the QAP campaign between 2003 and 2005. It suffered what I would call quite a comprehensive defeat, and there are bleak prospects for a revival. I do not think that Saudis returning from Iraq is going to change that. And the other reason is that Saudi Arabia is it's no longer a very potent cause for mobilizing other Muslims across the world, for two reasons. One is that the so-called US occupation of the holy places has, for all intents and purposes, ended, because the US scaled down its military presence significantly in May 2003, ironically just as the QAP campaign started. And the second reason is, of course, that the Saudi front has been eclipsed by other real occupations, if you will, in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. But what does this mean? And this is my fourth point, namely that the relegation of Saudi Arabia on Al-Qaeda's agenda shows that Al-Qaeda's ideology is malleable, that it is not a manifesto hewn in stone, but it's more of a flexible discourse that with interchangeable elements. And the key elements in this discourse are not sort of demands or causes that can be met, but they're symbols. More specifically, they're symbols of Muslims suffering at the hands of non-Muslims. They're Palestine, Chechnya, Iraq, etc. And in this perspective, in the current situation, Saudi Arabia is no longer a very potent symbol. There are other symbols that have taken its place, and so Saudi Arabia has been relegated. Now, a final word, to not sound too optimistic, is that although the prospects of an organized nationwide al-Qaeda campaign in Saudi Arabia have decreased, I think there's still a significant risk of ad hoc operations in the kingdom. Especially since Saudi security services seem relatively confident in having beaten al-Qaeda, and I think there's a chance that they might become a little bit blasé about the threat. You also have you have the threat from Iraq. There will be returnees, and although they won't form a nationwide organization, they may be able to launch ad hoc attacks. You have another factor which is not often mentioned, and that is the possibility of al-Qaeda using the South Asian expat population in the kingdom. With the Pakistanization of al-Qaeda and the huge South Asian population in the kingdom, that is a potential inroad for launching an important ad hoc attack, for example, against oil targets. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. I don't like standing up at the end because I'd love to sort of hear each one of the presentations go on a bit. I want to open the floor before I transition to our next panel at 2:30. But let me just, while we're getting the microphone and Ben out to take questions, let me ask Abdul Bari Atwan one question. Lawrence Wright earlier made the comment, as he sort of looked into the audience and said, if you were all al-Qaeda, you'd have different reasons for being here, and if the Palestinian-Israeli conflict were solved, two states were created, Osama bin Laden would be in tears. And I'd be interested, you know bin Laden, would that conflict and its resolution really make a substantial impact or not in al-Qaeda's fortunes in the region?
Yeah, I believe there are several elements which actually make al-Qaeda to shrink. I don't believe it is, a switch on, switch off button. It is a process. If we started, for example, by solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, if we accept that the war against terrorism is unwinnable and it's very costly and unbearable, if we accept that these Arab leaders who are there in power for 30, like the case of Muammar al-Gaddafi, 40 years, he is the youngest one anyway. So if we accept these kind of facts, yes, al-Qaeda will be deprived of a lot of ammunition, and it wouldn't actually have a leg to stand on. So it's, we have to start first to pull out the troops of Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq, to talk to Taliban. This is, to say, look, instead of going, sending messages, ambiguous messages vis-a-vis Karzai, to go directly, okay, just it is your country, because, Taliban is not alien to Afghanistan. It's not like al-Qaeda. This actually could help. Again, Iraq, we have to sort out something in Iraq. The presence of Iraqi troops there, American troops there, it wouldn't last. Again, we have been listening to the Israeli point of view for the last 60 years. So it is time to listen to the other point of view. It did not work for the last 60 years. So it is the right time now to say, look, let us listen to the Palestinians. At least let us listen to Ehud Olmert, the Israeli prime minister, who said we should pull out of Arab territories, we should give the Palestinian independent state, and any day we actually go without making peace with the Palestinian, we will regret it.
Mohammed, do you have a quick response?
No, other than to say that I agree wholeheartedly. Is this on or on?
Yes.
Okay. To me, it's a no-brainer. You deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict, and you probably deal with 50% of the problem of recruitment.
Interesting. Right here on the right. Yes.
Yes, I'm Paula Gordon. I have a website called GordonHomeland.com. I wondered, do you foresee different scenarios unfolding depending upon who becomes the next president? And I'd like to throw out a possibility that...
I need you to make your question very brief because we've got 15 minutes, so just go right to the question and say it loudly because the acoustics are poor in this room.
Oh, you didn't hear my question?
No, just lay out the... I didn't hear the question.
Oh, okay. Do you foresee different scenarios unfolding based on who becomes the next president?
Thank you. So the question is, do you think different scenarios in the region depending on who becomes president of the United States? Any comments? Yes, Mohammed?
I think if Barack Obama becomes president, it would help our image around the world tremendously. And that is why I fear that in this next month, October surprise, you'll have a tape from bin Laden saying something nice about Barack Obama, because if you do get John McCain, and I'm not biased here, I'm saying this honestly you will, in the Arab world, they will see John McCain as a continuation of Bush years, and again...
But let me push you on that just one second, Mohammed. You know, there's an element that could be at play that, while I agree with you that that's the way much of the world looks at it. In fact, I saw a cartoon recently showing a picture of the world in gray, and it said, with a little box of gray, for Obama, and then it had the United States and Alaska, you know, listed as undecided. But to raise this question, do you think expectations are so high of Barack Obama that you can actually produce a counter effect? And to some degree, having known former President Nixon, having looked at what Nixon himself achieved as the great anti-communist crusader, to some degree, does Obama have to, not to make you a political commentator about this, but what I worry about is an Obama comes in and can't be quite as liberal as everyone thinks he is and has to be something different. And McCain has a greater Nixon goes to China opportunity. And so I do worry about global expectations and are not meeting them. What would happen if Obama, if the Arab world gets satisfied, but then all of a sudden they don't see the A, B, and C move?
Right. Well, again, I think what I was responding to is initially what would be the image around the world, the fact that you have a person who represents a minority in the United States coming, that speaks tremendously to the character of the United States. But more importantly, I think Obama emphasizes this notion of diplomacy. The key critique that's been made about the United States in the last 8 years is that we do things first and then we get a coalition second. Secondly, Obama emphasizes the idea of not using only military means, but also dialogue, and I think that resonates with others. And finally, I think in the style of Obama, in terms of bringing people around and hearing from different perspectives, as opposed to being driven ideologically as it's perceived by the neoconservatives driving the current administration, I think all these things would even bode well. Again, maybe I'm showing my cards, but I think it would bode well for improving our image around the world.
Thank you. Barry?
Let us admit that the American image outside the United States is very bad. Yeah, you know, it's when 80% of the Pakistani, the major ally of the United States, support al-Qaeda, 80%. So we have to wake up. This is very simple. So I believe we need a change, not inside the United States. We need a change also outside the United States, and for the sake of the American interest and for the American security. I believe if we have a new president, if we have somebody courageous, for example, I don't believe McCain will do it, maybe Obama, say, look, you know, we made mistakes, we want to rectify this mistake, we want to rectify our image, we want actually to reverse the previous policies which put us in such problems, financial problems, security problems, political problems, economic problems, and there are new superpowers which are emerging now. Let us rectify that. If we have this leader, this president, I think, you know, all of us will be in better position.
Great. Gareth Porter?
Gareth Porter, Interpress Service. The discourse on al-Qaeda generally in this country today, and here on the panel, has really revolved around to what extent the surge made the difference and to what extent there were other factors. I'd like to just push back the clock to before '06, to when the al-Qaeda was certainly, as far as everybody knew, a very small part of the Sunni insurgency. Certainly not the most powerful part of it.
You're going to make it really brief, right?
I am coming to the question. The question I want to ask is, why shouldn't we really look at the Sunni insurgency itself, having turned against al-Qaeda in '05 over the strategic question of how do you react to the constitutional writing of the Constitution and the election, and the fact that they were already fighting a war against al-Qaeda by late '05.
Thank you.
Why should we see that as an argument against U.S. military presence?
I got it. Thanks, Gareth. Brian?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that the rest of the Sunni insurgency was turning on al-Qaeda that early, but I think that they hadn't come to the realization that that part of the Sunni insurgency had three enemies, right? They had the Iranians, and they perceived to be the Shia in Iraq to be proxies. They had us, and they had al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda was not the top of the list at that point. We were still. No, the Shia were still at the top of the list. We were number 2. And I think that what happened there is that in '06 we were able to move ourselves down on that list. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're off the list, but it means we moved ourselves down. And that's what I think the change in strategy did.
You can ask your question now, but I'm in control. So if you want to ask a question, take your chance, or we can move on.
This is probably for Mohammed Hafez. If you were advising the counterterrorism community, given what you said about the effect of the defeat of al-Qaeda in Iraq, that they would then scatter elsewhere, what would you advise from a strategic perspective to address that? And secondarily, what are other effects of the so to say, defeat of al-Qaeda in Iraq to al-Qaeda in a larger sense?
Thank you.
Part question.
Mohammed?
Well, I'll start with the second one. I think that the strategic defeat of al-Qaeda in Iraq is actually also a strategic defeat for al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Pakistan, because now we could possibly begin to shift our forces and our resources away from that theater, Iraq, towards Afghanistan, Pakistan. And so that is important to al-Qaeda leaders in those areas. Now, with regards to what can we do about the bleed out or the dispersal of the jihadists, I've written an article that sort of lays out some possible things. But one thing we need to do is to look at those conflict zones, the pathways that they could possibly go to places like Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. That would be a way to try to see the bleed out from in those directions, create nets if you were able to work with various intelligence services to be able to do that. I think second thing, when I studied the Arab-Afghan phenomena, one thing I noticed is that Arab Afghans sometimes wanted to go back to their home countries, but they couldn't. A lot of Egyptians wanted to go back, not necessarily to become militants, but to settle down. But the problem is their governments, seeing them as being in Afghanistan, saw them as a threat. They are likely going to be arrested or worse. So I think to the extent that we could do something like the Saudi model now, which allows, and we'll hear about this in the next panel, which allows returnees to have some form of reintegration, I think that would be, rather than criminalize their action, to say, okay, look, you've erred and you've gone to fight the Americans, and we know why you did it, because you were misguided and angry, but now we're going to work with you. Again, you have monitoring and things of that sort. I think these are some of the elements. I do lay it out in another piece of writing that I could sort of share with you.
We'll more
Steve, can I add to that? Just
yes, absolutely.
Briefly?
Go ahead, Brian.
There's one other way that al-Qaeda lost strategically from the strategic loss in Iraq, which is that they looked really bad while they did it. And that's important because we talk about the proliferation of media technologies. Al-Qaeda was an early adopter of that, but many of the other insurgent groups in Iraq picked that up as well and began to compete with Iraq, not just on the ground, but online. They began to compete at a global level, even though they don't really have global interests, and that's really important.
Yes, right here, very quickly, last question. We've got 30 seconds.
Munir Mawari, an independent journalist. My question is to Mr. Abdul Bari Atwan. You wrote in your paper an article saying that the next attack, the next possible attack could be on the Gulf area, and in particular maybe in United Arab Emirates. Could you educate the audience about how you came up with this conclusion?
Barry?
Well, actually, I wrote that article after the American government actually warned its citizen to be careful in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So I believe that al-Qaeda is actually trying to close in now because they cannot have any attacks in Saudi Arabia, for example. So maybe the soft belly is Abu Dhabi and Dubai and United Arab Emirates, simply because they changed their priorities. If you look recently, they attacked Ebgate complex, where the oil industry in Saudi Arabia is actually concentrated. So maybe for the sake of publicity first, and to say that we can reach these wealthy states again and create havoc, create fear. So they may do so. So I based my article on the American warning to their citizen, and which was surprising to everybody. And it is personally, I believe it is a matter of time and timing.
Before we close, I want to ask Tom one question about Saudi Arabia. I was there earlier this year, and I agree from what I could learn about and see that I didn't feel as if the environment was conducive to al-Qaeda cells, and as we'll talk about probably in the next panel, I found some surprisingly enlightened strategies in turning jihadists into non-jihadists or reform jihadists. But I also noticed something that some people disagree with me, but is essentially very, very definitive moves of the king in the kingdom regarding various other kinds of liberal discourse or liberal tilting discourse in some ways. The expansion of blogging and whatnot. And because your title of this is Whatever Happened to the Liberation of the Two Holy Places, al-Qaeda's Saudi Failures, there is this custodian responsibility which the King of Saudi Arabia has. And I'm wondering whether these shifts inside the kingdom are influencing the region or not. And and whether you agree there are shifts in the kingdom.
Yes.
It's on.
Well, yes, there is a slight... there are slight changes going on in the kingdom. There's a slight social liberalization in particular on the points that you mentioned. But I think that these developments did not affect the al-Qaeda in the kingdom. Al-Qaeda lost basically for operational reasons. It lost because it didn't have support in the population, and because the security services went through a spectacular increase in capability. We have to remember that in 2002, the Saudi security services were not very efficient at all. It was a very permissive environment for those who tried to prepare the campaign. Now, however, they've made quantum leaps in signals intelligence and analytical methods and so on. And the state now controls the roads, the internet, the telephone network and everything. So it's extremely difficult for al-Qaeda to mobilize on a nationwide level. So I think these factors are more important than the political changes of King Abdullah.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Abdul Bari Atwan, Brian Fishman, Mohammed Hafez, and Tom Hammer. And we're going to now transition to Peter Bergen, who will